first got into synthesizers, my first was a Korg micro preset, followed by a Korg 770. My third one was a micro Moog, which I bought along with a Krumar string synth. My first real exposure to electronic music technology was as a 6th or 7th grader in elementary school, hearing a switched on Bach for the first time. And, sounds that I'd never heard before, sounds that I'd never imagined were even possible. And in some ways, I think their, say, mathematical or electrical purity was startling too. Some debate on whether electronic musics are expressive or not compared to other instruments, and what their overtone structure is. And the sounds were a little bit less messy than natural acoustic instruments. It makes me think about how people's tastes change over the years.
So how did you decide what was expressive or not? Did you have already a ripened taste or understanding of what expressivity is?
What we would think of now as expressivity wasn't that big a concern for me. The new timbres were something that was more grabbing my ear. I pretty early on became a big fan of the group Yes. I simultaneously was developing an interest in a lot of early music. On a dishwasher's salary, I was sometimes buying 3, 4, 5 albums a week. I became interested in very old and very new classical music. And what captured my ear about Yes was I particularly loved some of the quieter interludes where like Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe were doing these quasi-classical guitar-ish stuff, with Wakeman doing this kind of like fluty mini Moog lead over that. And I just ate that stuff up. I love that. And, another album that came out back around then that really influenced me a lot was Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. This was back when multi-tracking was still somewhat in its infancy, and the ability for one musician to play all those different instruments was like, I don't have to pick just one instrument.
Of your interest in acquiring new technology, what would you say have been the pieces that impressed you most and why?
Synthesizers in general, I think, impressed me. When I first got interested in them, none of the music stores in town had them. And somewhere, I don't know if I had a subscription or was just buying it at the newsstand, but Keyboard Magazine, which was called Contemporary Keyboard back then. And I saw somewhere where I could write into the ARP company, and they sent me 4 brochures. It was for their Pro Soloists, ARP Odyssey, the 2600 and the 2500. And that was my only contact with synthesizers for a long time, was just reading those brochures over and over again. I'm like, I wonder what a filter is, wonder what it does. I really liked lutes, which still continues to this day with my oud here. There were a couple of Paco Bell lute suites and stuff, and then there were some groups out of the English new folk tradition that had like lute players, like Jethro Tull too. I particularly love the way that they brought some of that Tudor England musical sensibility into it. And years later, Peter Gabriel opened my ears a little bit, and got into Middle Eastern music. Just recently got this new Godin multi-oud after probably 4, 5, or 6 other more traditional design ouds.
If there was a flood about to approach you and you had to select just a few, we all have our own reasons for our own treasures, but what are yours and why?
Do I take this gear? Well, that depends on if I also have this piece of equipment that I need with it or not. So there's all kind of dependencies. I think some of that harkens back to the whole digital analog debate. When I first had my first analog synthesizers, I would say I probably didn't appreciate them as much as I should have.
What do you mean by that?
I'd say probably almost everybody that had them didn't really realize what their quality was, as far as how the warmth of the sound and a number of different things. Till a lot of the digital synths came out, like the DX7 and things like that. And it's not to bash the DX7. I didn't own a DX7, but I owned a lot of Yamaha's 4-operator synths. I had a DX100, I had the CX5M music computer, TX81Z, like I had an FB01 or something, one or two other, the smaller ones, and I loved it. You know, somewhat difficult to program, but yeah.
How much time did you take to get accustomed to FM synthesis?
I was studying frequency modulation in college at the time, so I kind of knew what was going on. But even then, you know, predicting, switching from one algorithm to another, or one frequency relationship to another, and what's going to come out, you know, I didn't really know. After a while, I kind of did. I had an oscillator and modulated it by another one that was half its frequency and dropped it down. I could kind of get that DX7 fretless bass sound out of it, but a lot of it was just experimentation.
How much of the soft synths and programming do you do?
A fair amount now. My first album, Xenography, came about when I bought Logic. Xenography was really my first exploration of soft synths, and did a lot of rhythmic stuff with Ableton that I wound up importing into Logic. I had a friend of mine down in Greenville who developed an iOS sequencer app called Koushion, and it's kind of a grid-based step sequencer. I would use that a lot, sync to Ableton, controlling a soft synth in there, and so it was real easy for me to experiment around with different sequences. And I would use kind of a percussive tom type of sound, run that into a bunch of different Ableton beat repeats and filters and things, making layers and layers and layers and bringing them into Logic to put together, and then adding the other instruments. As far as the kind of the philosophy behind all that, you know, use soft synths, don't use them. I use them a lot now, and I'm still using a lot of hardware too. One album I did called the Krell Suite is entirely a make noise zero coast run into the Eventide Effect plugins, the whole anthology suite, which is great.
How would you suggest that they get started? Young artists who have only just recently discovered technology or music electronics.
I learned to slowly decipher music, which I can still do. I do not say I read music. You know, when I was in my early teens, a lot of my friends were picking up guitar, and I had taken maybe one or two guitar lessons a little bit before that. So I kind of knew, you know, where a C was on a guitar, where a D was. And so I started ping-ponging back and forth between, you know, I'd learn something on guitar and I'd apply to piano. I did that throughout the rest of my life. I'd learn something on one instrument and see, you know, can I apply it to something else? I learned something on guitar, hey, can I apply that chord voicing on a synthesizer? But what I would suggest as far as advice, you know, I run into a lot of people who seem to be proud that they haven't learned something, which kind of hits a nerve with me sometimes. And yeah, you can do things without studying something, but I'm not proud that I didn't learn how to read music. Well, I didn't. I was able to do some things, but I'm not going to brag about it. So, you know, never pass up an opportunity to learn something. And just because you can do something without learning it doesn't mean it's not useful. And, you know, you don't know how useful it is until you know it sometimes. But I would say learn some basic composition and theory and song structure, because I hear a lot of music and it's pretty obvious it's not there. Some of it doesn't need it, you know, for a particular purpose. If you're making dance music, what you're doing is getting people up dancing, don't worry about it. But, you know, I think in the long run it's more satisfying if you're putting a little bit more into it. I read a great quote recently, I'm trying to remember who said it, a painter or a musician, a composer from 100 years ago, and it was the main question of any work of art is, from how deep a life does it spring? Try not to be superficial. Dig in beyond technology. Reveal some deep truth somehow, and that's a very nonverbal thing sometimes, but try to have some substance to what you do. That's my main advice.
Anything you want to reveal, whether it's an adventure, a revelation, event, or activity, or knowledge?
I went to college right after high school, and that didn't really stick, so I went back to work, and part of that was spending 5 years in a zinc die casting factory, lifting 20,000 pounds of metal a day. Would not suggest that as a career path. You know, during this time I was actually buying synthesizers. Got interested in them, and hey, what's happening when I turn this knob? So that inspired me to go get a degree in electrical engineering, which I just got a 2-year degree at a local technical college, but gave me a pretty good background. I got out of there and spent the next 10 years as a printed circuit board designer for a company making industrial computers. During that time, unbeknownst to me, Bob Moog was living an hour away in Asheville, North Carolina. I was in South Carolina at the time, and saw that he was giving a lecture at the local college where he was teaching. Made sure I was there, attended the lecture, and after it was over, I went up and introduced myself, gave him my card, and said, if you ever need a printed circuit designer, give me a call. Well, this is back before the days of cell phone. Next morning I'm at work and he calls me on my phone in my office. I'm like, oh my God, it's Bob Moog, it's Bob Moog. So I wound up doing a couple of printed circuit board designs for him on his multi-touch keyboard, which was basically one of the forerunners of a lot of the MPE MIDI stuff you're seeing now. After 10 years, the circuit board designer there, I went to work for another company that did cable TV electronics, and throughout 10 years there, I kind of segued into marketing at that point. I was marketing manager, but at some points I was also engineering manager and manufacturing manager. After that company is when I went to work for Moog, so I was marketing manager at Moog for almost 4 years. And after I left Moog, I kind of stayed in the business in various ways. I did some work with Paul Vo on the Low 96 Kickstarter. My friend I mentioned did the Koushion step sequencer. Worked with John Worthington on the Jambé drum iOS synth. It's hard for me to deny the part that luck played in a lot of this. There's an old saying, was it fortune favors the bold or the prepared? I studied hard in school, I got good grades, worked hard, and so when opportunities that were hard to say were more than just random luck came along, I was able to take advantage of them because I was prepared to take advantage of them. I have some nephews, and I told them truthfully is that I got to hang out backstage at a Lady Gaga concert because I got good grades in math. One of Lady Gaga's keyboard players was a big Moog user, and they were playing in Charlotte. So I had to go meet with him before the concert and show him some new gear. And so as part of that, they were doing the sound check, so I actually got to go up on her stage, which was a huge thing. It was like a multi-layered, multi-tiered thing, and the keyboard player was up on the second level, so he took me up there to show me his setup. So I'm standing up there looking at his Voyager, and interesting setup he had where he was standing on a mat that would trigger the vibration from the drummer's kick drum to his feet, so it was like a metronome for him, so he could tell where his time was. But anyway, while I'm standing up there, all of a sudden this pillar of flame shoots up beside my head, and they were testing Lady Gaga's fire-breathing grand piano down below me.
And you left with your hair intact.
Most of it, yeah. A lot of interesting things like that. Lou Reed was in my office once. He came by the Moog factory right before we introduced the Moog guitar. And it was like 2 weeks before we were going to introduce it. And so we showed it to him, and he was blown away by it. So we're giving him the factory tour, and at one point he's in my office. And I've been a Laurie Anderson fan forever. I mean, she was probably one of my top 3 favorite artists. And I had a Laurie Anderson tour poster up on my walls. And he gives me this look like, you've got a picture of my wife in your office. And they're like, I guess that's okay.